There is a photograph I keep thinking about. Giorgia Meloni stepping off a plane in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. Red Sea wind, desert light, the unmistakable geometry of a Gulf city that knows exactly what it is worth. She didn't announce the trip in advance. No press conference in Rome the day before, no official EU communique at dawn, no coordinated statement from Brussels. She just went. Quietly, quickly, the way someone goes somewhere when they know the situation is more serious than the official language they've been using for weeks. It was April 3rd, 2026. And in that single, unannounced flight, the entire European energy story of this decade was told in miniature. She was the first leader of the European Union, first leader of NATO, first leader of the G20 to visit the Gulf since the United States and Israel launched their strikes on Iran on February 28th. 34 days had passed. 34 days during which the Strait of Hormuz had effectively ceased to function as a global shipping lane. 34 days during which Europe's energy bill had been climbing, gas prices had jumped 60%, and Brussels had been holding emergency sessions, drafting letters, calling video conferences with energy ministers, and producing statements that sounded serious without being actionable. 34 days. And then Meloni moved. This is the story I wanted to tell you today. Not just about one prime minister making a surprise trip to Saudi Arabia. That's the surface. Underneath it, there's something much larger. A structural crack that has been widening in European geopolitics for years, now suddenly illuminated by the fire of a war in the Persian Gulf. It's a story about what European energy security actually means when it gets tested. It's a story about who moves when the music stops and who keeps talking. It's a story about the gap between Brussels and the real world. Let's go back a little. Not far, just to the morning of February 28th, 2026. That's the day US and Israeli forces launched coordinated strikes against Iran. The immediate global reaction was predictable in its broad strokes and shocking in its speed. Within hours, IRGC commanders were on VHF radio, warning every vessel in the Strait of Hormuz that the waterway was closed. Not legally, Iran never issued a formal declaration of blockade in the technical maritime sense, but practically, functionally, commercially, the message was unmistakable. Any ship that tried to pass would be set ablaze. Within 48 hours, maritime insurers began pulling coverage. Without insurance, no tanker captain in the world will sail. Without tankers, the oil doesn't move. Within a week, around 150 ships were anchored on both sides of the strait, waiting. The traffic that normally roars through that 54-kilometer passage, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil per day, plus one-fifth of the world's entire LNG supply, had dropped by 70%. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment because we've all become slightly numb to large figures in this era of crisis communication. 20 million barrels per day. That is not a marginal flow. That is approximately one-fifth of everything the world burns. And not just crude. Fertilizers, sulfur, LPG, jet fuel, aluminum feedstock. The strait is not only an oil highway, it is a commodity artery of breathtaking breadth. Around 30% of global fertilizer trade passes through it. When that flow stops, you're not just talking about driving costs and heating bills, you're talking about food. But let's come back to Europe specifically, because this is where the story gets interesting. Here is the thing about Europe and the Strait of Hormuz that most commentators glossed over in the first days of the crisis. The EU does not depend on Hormuz the way Japan does, or South Korea, or India. Europe gets most of its oil from Norway, the North Sea Basin, the United States, West Africa. It gets its gas from Norway, Algeria, the US in the form of LNG, and, after the catastrophic renegotiation of its own energy architecture forced by the Ukraine war, a diversified but still fragile patchwork of sources. Qatar was providing around 10% of Italy's total gas consumption before February 28th. For Europe as a whole, the direct Hormuz exposure is real, but not existential in the way it is for Asia. And yet, Europe is in energy crisis, gas prices up 60%, the EU Energy Commissioner calling for member states to encourage people to work from home, to slow down on highways, to use public transport. The European Commission calculating that in just over 1 month of conflict, The war had already added 14 billion euros to Europe's fossil fuel import bill. How do you explain this apparent paradox? Europe doesn't directly depend on Hormuz that much, and yet Europe is bleeding. This is the part that most people haven't fully grasped. The global energy market is not a collection of separate national supply chains. It is a single interconnected web of prices, shipping routes, refining capacity, and contractual flows. When 20 million barrels per day disappear from one section of that web, every other section tightens. The Asian buyers who can no longer get Gulf oil pivot to West African supplies, supplies that European refineries also relied on. LNG tankers that were heading to European terminals get diverted to Asian ports where desperate buyers are paying premiums. Brent crude, the global benchmark, shoots past $100 and touches 120. And Europe, even with its North Sea oil and its Norwegian gas and its American LNG, pays those global prices. The pump price in Italy, in Germany, in Poland, in Spain goes up. Industry energy costs go up. Inflation, which had only just been tamed, begins to creep back. This is what financial analysts mean when they talk about price transmission. It is painfully direct, and it does not care about your geographic distance from the conflict zone. Now, here is the part I want you to really pay attention to because this is the structural story. Europe spent the years between 2014 and 2022 believing, genuinely, institutionally, technocratically believing that it had solved its energy problem. It had passed ambitious renewable energy directives. It had set net zero timelines. It had built interconnectors, reformed gas markets, signed LNG agreements with the United States. The 2022 Ukraine shock was catastrophic, yes, but Europe got through it. Russian gas was replaced. Terminals were built almost overnight. New suppliers were brought online. Von der Leyen gave speeches about energy independence that sounded almost triumphant by the autumn of 2023. And then the Hormuz crisis came, and what it revealed was not incompetence exactly. European technocrats are very competent people. What it revealed was a category error. Europe had been solving for the wrong kind of energy crisis. It had been solving for the 2022 kind, a political rupture with a single supplier, Russia, that could be addressed by finding other suppliers, which it did. It had not been solving for the kind of crisis that the Hormuz closure represents, a disruption to the global pricing system itself, caused by a war in which Europe had no direct role but from which it could not escape the economic consequences. There's no pipeline alternative when global prices spike. There's no backup supplier when the entire spot market convulses. The medicine Europe prepared was for the last disease, not this one. And the Brussels machine, faithful to its nature, did what it always does when faced with a challenge that exceeds its frameworks. It held meetings, very serious meetings, mind you, emergency sessions of energy ministers, video conferences, statements from Commissioner Jurgensen about supply security being contained, but preparations being necessary. On March 31st, a letter went out from the Commission urging member states to prepare timely and coordinated measures. The European Commission called on EU countries to contribute approximately 20% to an IEA emergency release of over 400 million barrels of strategic reserves. The language was careful, measured, appropriately urgent without being alarmist. Meanwhile, in the real world, LNG tankers were changing course mid-voyage. This is the asymmetry that defines the current European political moment. There is the Brussels world, the world of regulations, directives, emergency frameworks, qualified majority voting, impact assessments, coordinated statements, and fiscal rules that cannot be suspended even during an energy war. And there is the world where things actually happen. Bilateral deals cut in Riyadh, gas contracts negotiated in Algiers, tanker routes redirected in Singapore, emergency deliveries arranged at terminals in Wilhelmshaven and Marseille. Meloni operates in the second world, and that's what makes her Gulf trip so revealing and so politically potent inside Europe. Let me tell you what she was actually doing there. In the weeks before the Jeddah trip, Italy had already been scrambling. Rome had visited Algeria in late March to secure additional natural gas from the North African country. Algeria already provides around 30% of Italy's natural gas, and Meloni wanted more. Italy was also in negotiations to receive LNG from the Golden Pass facility in the United States, with first deliveries expected in June. The country had already deployed aerial defense systems to the Gulf region. And crucially, and this is the detail that almost nobody covered, Italy had been notified by its Qatari LNG supplier that 10 cargoes scheduled between April and mid-June would not be shipped. Force majeure. The Strait of Hormuz is closed for commercial purposes. The gas that Italy was counting on does not exist in its pipeline system for the next 2 months. 10 cargoes. Depending on cargo size, we're talking about millions of cubic meters of gas that Italy simply will not receive. So Meloni went to the Gulf, to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to the UAE, the three states that hold the keys to most of the Gulf's accessible energy capacity outside Iran. She went to show support for partners who were themselves under Iranian missile and drone attack. She went to ask for what Italy needed. She went because waiting for Brussels to produce a coordinated EU response would have meant sitting in a chair while the heating bill for every Italian household continued to rise. This is not a criticism of the EU process per se. The EU process serves important purposes. It prevents member states from undercutting each other, prevents the kind of beggar-thy-neighbor national energy subsidies that would distort the single market, prevents Germany from cornering all available LNG supplies and leaving Portugal in the cold. The coordination imperative is real, but the coordination machine is slow and energy markets are fast. Here is the deeper political problem that Meloni's trip exposes. Europe went into this crisis already internally fractured on energy. Italy had argued even before the Gulf War for more radical measures in Brussels, including actions affecting the carbon market. Germany, Sweden, and Romania had already declared they would not buy Russian gas again, not under any circumstances, even as prices rose. Gas supplies from Russia would mean a return to an absolutely unsafe situation and support for a warmonger. It's impossible, Berlin said. Poland was resisting any measure that would touch the proceeds of the carbon trading system because those revenues flow to national budgets. Spain and Croatia had moved to tax reductions and fuel price caps at the national level. The European Commission, caught between these competing national interests and its own institutional imperatives around fiscal rules and climate objectives, was trying to hold the center. It is very hard to hold a center when the centrifugal forces are this strong. And hovering over all of this, spectral and unavoidable, is the question of what Europe's relationship to this war actually is. The United States launched the strikes. Israel participated. Both are NATO allies of most EU member states. The war happened without European involvement, without European consent, arguably without European awareness of the precise timing. Kaja Kallas, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, had already told reporters before the March Brussels summit, member states do not have an appetite to go to this war. That is a remarkable sentence. It is diplomatic language for, we are in a war alliance with the country that started this war, but we are not in this war, and we would like everyone to understand the distinction. The distinction is harder to maintain when your energy system is paying the price of the conflict. It was Kallas herself who floated what became known as the Black Sea Model idea, a proposal to create a negotiated diplomatic framework for reopening commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, broadly inspired by the grain corridor mechanism that had briefly functioned in the Black Sea during the Ukraine war. The idea was not purely military. It was a diplomatic architecture, a set of guarantees, international oversight, perhaps UN involvement, that would allow commercial tankers to pass without becoming targets. An innovative proposal, characteristically from someone who understands that Europe has limited military options and must therefore invent diplomatic ones. But the Black Sea model for Hormuz faces a fundamental obstacle that the original Black Sea model did not face. The Ukraine grain corridor worked because Russia, despite being at war, had a commercial and diplomatic incentive to allow it. It softened international criticism and provided some benefit to Russian-aligned interests. Iran has no such incentive at the moment. The strait is Iran's primary leverage. Reopening it for Western commercial traffic before a ceasefire or a political settlement would be surrendering that leverage for free. Iran is unlikely to do that. EU foreign ministers had also met to debate whether to expand the Aspides mission, the naval operation launched in the Red Sea in 2024 in response to Houthi attacks on shipping. The debate ended without expansion. Some governments were not convinced. The political will for active European military presence in the Persian Gulf simply isn't there, and it probably shouldn't be, given the complexity of the situation. And so Europe finds itself in a position that is deeply uncomfortable and structurally revealing, paying the price of a war it did not choose, unable to end the war, unable to reopen the shipping lane that would solve its immediate problem, dependent on individual member state diplomacy, like Meloni's, for short-term supply arrangements, and unable to agree on a unified response that would spread the burden equitably across 27 member states with wildly different energy situations. This is the third energy crisis in 4 years. After 2022, Europe told itself the lesson had been learned. Diversify, reduce dependence on any single supplier, accelerate the energy transition. The European Council's conclusions from March 19, 2026, even found room to note that renewable energy's share of the EU electricity mix had risen from 36% in 2021 to roughly 48% in 2025. Real progress, genuine progress. But here's the thing about renewable electricity. It doesn't run your diesel trucks. It doesn't fly your airplanes. It doesn't power your petrochemical industry or your merchant shipping. Europe's electricity system is becoming greener. Europe's liquid fuel system, the transportation, the industrial feedstocks, the heating, is still deeply embedded in global fossil fuel markets. And global fossil fuel markets run through choke points: the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Strait of Hormuz. Fixing Europe's electricity mix was necessary, it was not sufficient. The two things are not the same. There's a broader geopolitical frame here that I want to bring in because without it the picture is incomplete. While Europe was holding emergency meetings in Brussels and Meloni was flying to Jeddah, something very different was happening on the other side of the ledger. Russia, which has not fired a single shot in this war, was watching its competitive position in global oil markets improve dramatically. With Middle Eastern barrels unable to reach traditional buyers, India and China, the two largest emerging market importers, were turning even more decisively toward Russian crude. Moscow had always had established logistics routes to both New Delhi and Beijing. Now those routes were becoming more valuable by the week. The Americans had even temporarily suspended sanctions on 30 Russian-connected petroleum tankers to allow them to move stranded supplies, a tactical concession that Russia noted carefully and will not forget diplomatically. And China, which had quietly accumulated strategic crude reserves during the period of global supply abundance in 2023 and early 2024, was sitting on a buffer that allowed it to weather the storm with relative composure. Beijing also happened to be on the list of countries whose ships were allowed to transit the Strait of Hormuz under Iran's selective passage policy, along with Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan. The dividing line Iran drew was not random. It was a geopolitical statement. Countries that had maintained relationships with Tehran, that had not participated in sanctions or military action, would receive preferential treatment. Countries aligned with Washington would not. This is the multipolar energy order being written in real time. Iran's passage list is a diplomatic document. It tells you who sits where in the emerging global order. Europe is not on that list. The European Commission's Energy Commissioner said something very honest in early April. He said this would be a long crisis. He said energy prices would be higher for a very long time. These are not the words of a bureaucrat trying to manage expectations through mild pessimism. These are the words of someone who has read the assessments and knows that even if the war ends tomorrow, the shipping routes, the insurance frameworks, the tanker positioning, the infrastructure damage to Gulf facilities, desalination plants hit in Kuwait, the Habshan gas facility in Abu Dhabi catching fire from intercepted missile debris, aluminum smelters in the UAE and Bahrain damaged by Iranian attacks. None of that repairs itself overnight. The physical and logistical architecture of the Gulf energy system has been disrupted in ways that will take months to normalize even under the most optimistic scenarios. And in the meantime, Europe pays. Now, I want to be fair to Brussels here because it would be too easy and too wrong to simply say Brussels failed. That's not the story. The European Commission has been doing what a commission can do. It called for coordination. It organized the largest strategic reserve release in history. It pressed member states to act. Commissioner Jurgensen's letters to energy ministers were specific and practical: reduce oil demand in transport, consider speed limits, encourage remote work, ensure gas storage fills early for next winter. These are not nothing. The problem is not that Brussels failed to act. The problem is that the architecture of European energy security, built on the assumption that crises could be managed through coordination mechanisms, reserve releases, and diversified supply contracts, was designed for a world where geopolitical disruption happened at the margins, not at the center of the global system. The Hormuz closure is not a marginal disruption, it is the global energy system's central pressure point being squeezed. And a pressure point at the center of the system cannot be managed from Brussels through video calls. Meloni understood this, which is why she was in Jeddah speaking directly to Mohammed bin Salman rather than waiting for a qualified majority vote on a common EU response. This is the kind of bilateral speed that the EU architecture by design makes difficult. The single market, the common trade policy, the coordination imperative, these are features, not bugs, of European integration, but they carry a cost in reflexes. Nation states can move fast. The EU moves carefully. In a crisis that moves at the speed of a tanker market, careful is expensive. And here is what I think is the most important long-term consequence of what we are watching. More important than the immediate price spikes, more important than even the diplomatic scramble. What this crisis is doing, slowly and relentlessly, is renationalizing European energy policy in practice, even while it remains theoretically European in law. Every bilateral deal Meloni cuts with Riyadh or Algiers is a piece of European energy policy that was made in Rome, not Brussels. Every national subsidy that Germany, Spain, or Croatia introduces is a distortion of the European single market that has to be retrospectively accommodated. Every member state that makes its own emergency LNG arrangements is building a supply architecture that is national, not common. After 2022, Europe said, "Never again will we be dependent on a single supplier." The lesson learned was the right lesson, but it was interpreted as a market diversification problem, not a governance problem. And the governance problem is now showing itself clearly. The EU can coordinate. But in the gap between coordination and action, there is a space where national interests move fast. Bilateral diplomacy operates without European oversight, and the carefully built architecture of common energy markets quietly fragments. The question that haunts me, watching Meloni in Jeddah and watching Brussels produce another set of coordinated recommendations, is this: after this crisis ends, and it will end, all crises end, will Europe do what it did after 2022? Will it declare the lesson learned, diversify a few more supply contracts, accelerate the renewable energy targets, produce a new energy security strategy with ambitious language, and then move on? Or will it ask the harder question? The harder question is this: what does it actually mean to have a common European energy policy, not just in law and on paper, but in the moment when it matters? When ships are anchored, prices are spiking, and every government is scrambling to protect its own citizens before it protects the European single market? I don't have a clean answer. Nobody does. This is one of those questions that European integration has been deferring for decades because the moments when it became urgent were always followed by moments when the crisis passed and deferral became possible again. The Hormuz crisis may not be defeatable this time. The EU Energy Commissioner himself said it could be prolonged. The physical damage to Gulf infrastructure will last. The geopolitical realignment, China and Russia strengthening their position as preferred suppliers to Asia, Iran's passage list reordering the hierarchy of global partnerships, is not reversible in any short time frame. The structural transformation of global energy trade that this war has accelerated was already underway before February 28th. It has just been compressed. Europe is watching a world being reorganized around energy relationships that it had not fully prepared for. The Hormuz crisis is not the cause of that reorganization. It is the accelerant. And Meloni in Jeddah is the image that captures better than any policy document what European energy sovereignty actually looks like in practice in April 2026. A head of government on an unannounced trip to a Gulf monarchy asking for gas while the Brussels machinery drafts its next round of coordinated recommendations. Both things are real. Both things are necessary. But only one of them will keep the lights on this winter. I'll leave you with a question, the kind of question that I think deserves more than a quick answer. Europe has spent 15 years building an energy system designed to be independent of Russia, resilient to political pressure, compatible with climate objectives, and governed by shared rules. It has made genuine progress on all of those dimensions. The renewable share of the electricity mix really did go from 36 to 48% in 4 years. The Russian gas dependence really was broken at enormous cost. The diversification really happened. And yet here we are. So the question is not whether Europe has done enough, it has done a great deal. The question is whether the category of enough has changed, whether the world has moved in a direction where enough in 2022 is insufficient in 2026, whether the speed of geopolitical disruption has simply outpaced the institutional velocity of European governance. If that's true, and I think it might be, then the implication is not that the EU needs better policies inside its current framework. The implication is that the framework itself needs to change, that the gap between the Brussels world and the Meloni and Jeddah world needs to close, that European energy security cannot be managed in video conferences when the crisis is moving faster than the scheduling of those video conferences. How you close that gap without sacrificing the coordination that makes Europe a coherent single market rather than 27 competing nation states, that is the question that Europe's leaders need to answer before the next crisis arrives. And given the current trajectory of global geopolitics, the next crisis will not wait long.